In this tutorial, we'll create this dynamic water body using xpOcean and xpFluidFX. So let's get started. So let's bring in an xParticles system object, which is our hierarchy, and we'll just make that xParticles logo invisible. We'll deselect icon in viewport. All right, so what we're going to do first is we're not even going to think about making any ocean animations at this stage. The first task is to create a dynamic water body which will interact with our collider object and create some really nice detailed foam. So that's the first task, and to do that we're going to use our dynamic solver xpFluidFX. So let's get that scene set up. What we want to do is have this water body contained within a cube. So we'll bring in just a primitive cube. Let's give that a tag. We'll go to the render tag. So let's put a display tag on there, and we'll change it from the shading to lines. So there's our cube. Everything's going to happen inside of here. So we want the particles to bounce inside of this cube. So we need to give it a collider tag. So we'll go to tags, xParticles tags, collider. And let's take all that bounce away. And we want the normals inside. So the particles are bouncing inside of this cube. Let's have a look at the dimensions of that cube. We'll go to the coordinates. So 200 by 200 by 200. We'll leave it at that for now. So now we're going to make our particle emitter. So let's just take this standard emitter, which by default is this square, and we will change that. Let's go to the Object tab, and we'll go to the emitter shape and change it from rectangle to box. And the box, we want the X and the Z to be the same as our collider box. So let's just put that at 200 and 200, and then we want the Y to to be the height of our water body. Really, it'll compress slightly, but let's say let's have a look. Maybe 30 could do for now. All right, and then what we want to do, I'm just going to go to the orthographic views. Let's hit 5. And it brings up all of those. And look, we'll pick this side-on view, and let's just bring that emitter down. And so it's sitting right at the bottom with our collider. Excellent. And then hit F1, back to our perspective view. Right, let's go into that emitter. Let's get organized as well. We'll go to basic and let's rename it. We'll call it emitter water body. Excellent. And we'll go to the emission tab. Now, we don't want to emit all frames. We just want to shoot these out on the first frame. So let's deselect emit all frames. Start emit 0, end emit frame 1. We don't want rate. We want to birth these in a really tightly packed grid. So the best way of doing that is to use hexagonal mode. And then hexagonal mode uses the particle radius to dictate how many particles it can fit within this non-intersecting grid. Let's just go forward a frame. So now you can see we've got this non-intersecting grid. Let's just take all that speed away, respawn them. So there they are. Let's reduce that particle radius down to 2, which means we'll have more particles because you can fit more within that space, and we'll just leave it at that for now. Let's color those differently so it looks a little bit like water just while we're building this. We'll go to the display tab. Let's change the color mode. Well, we'll change the display mode from dots to squares, and we'll change the color mode from single color to gradient parameter. And let's just move that up. We'll change the parameter from age to speed, and then we'll hit auto. So that just means that at any one time, the slowest particles will be blue and the fastest particles will be white. So now if we hit play, nothing's going to happen. We've just got a load of static particles. There are no forces. There's no dynamic solvers in this scene. We've just got our particles. So let's sort that out. We will first of all go to our dynamics tab, and we're going to use we've got 3 different fluid solvers in xParticles. There is the XP domain, which is a flip solver. We have got xpFluidPBD, which is a particle-based dynamics fluid solver. And then we have xpFluidFX, which is an SPH fluid solver. They all solve the fluid particle animation using a slightly different method. So each have their own characteristics. We're going to use xpFluidFX for this one. So we'll just bring it into the scene. And we're not going to touch any of the settings, actually. We're going to keep it on default, apart from in the accuracy preset, we're going to change it from fast to medium. And what this will do is it will use more substeps, so it'll more accurately work out the velocity of the particles, and it will have more iterations, which will more accurately work out the fluid density of the particles. All of that's happening under the hood. We stick it on medium, it's just going to be more accurate. Okay, so we've got FluidFX, hit play. Still, we haven't got much movement going on here, and that's because there are no forces in the scene. So let's bring in a force. We want a gravity. So we'll go to Modifiers, Motion Modifiers, Gravity. Now if we hit play, you'll see they fall and they start kind of settling. And there we've got our water body. So now that this is an active fluid simulation, let's bring in a collider object. So we'll get I'm just going to use a primitive. Let's bring in a platonic. Now that's huge. Let's just bring this way down to say, let's have a look at that platonic radius, maybe 10 centimeter radius, maybe 15. Okay, good. And we'll just bring that down. This green circle here is the arrow of the gravity modifier showing us the direction of the gravitational force. So let's just make that invisible. We don't need to see that. So now we have this platonic in the scene. If we hit play, nothing will happen because it doesn't have any collider information. If we give our platonic a collider tag, let's go to tags, xParticles tags, collider. Let's remove that bounce. Add a little bit of friction. So now those fluid particles will interact with this. And if we move our platonic, you can see, look, it's sloshing about that fluid. All right, so we already have a interactive water body going on here. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's just go to our emitter. Can you see at the moment we've got a bit of particle movement going on here, so it looks like the particles are flashing with color. The reason that's happening is if we go to the emitter water body to the display, because we've got it set to auto, it maps this gradient to the whole body of water every frame. And so at some parts, the slowest moving particle might only be moving 1 centimeter a second, and that will be blue. But on the next frame, the slowest moving particle might be moving 20 centimeters a frame, and that is then colored blue. And so it can look a bit flashy if you use the auto. So if we just don't use the auto and just put, say, a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 200, it's now going to be a much more consistent gradient. Okay, because always the particle moving at 0 will have this blue. So let's then get our platonic, and if we move it around, look at that. Got a really nice interactive water body. So that's pretty cool. Let's increase our scene frames to, say, 300 frames. So instead of moving this platonic around, let's just set a bit of automated animation, and we'll do that using a vibrate tag. So we'll go to tags, simulation tags, and actually no, it's animation tags, and vibrate. Let's activate that tag, and let's say we want it to move 100 centimeters on the X and the Z, and we want it to move at, say, 1.2. So there we go. And now we've got some animation on our platonic, making our water body move about the place. That's looking quite nice. Now, it looks quite slow, but remember, this isn't animating in real time. So the actual movement of this platonic when we do a render will be much quicker, and it's going to look really nice. Okay, so let's just make a couple of adjustments. to our fluid, and we're going to do that not in the FluidFX settings. We've set that, we're going to keep it at medium and everything else on default. But if we go to our emitter water body, we can go to the extended data tab, and then look, we have a fluid data tab. So let's go there. And what we're going to do, what I'd like is a little bit more vorticity, which is kind of like the natural swirling turbulence of the water. So let's just increase the vorticity large and the vorticity small up to, say, 30. Which should give us some nicer curls and tighter kind of ripples. You can see, I mean, you can see here that the swirling nature of this water body is already working really nicely. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now, what is going to bring the detail to this is not the fluid particles, but is creating some foam particles. So let's get that sorted now. We will go to our dynamics menu, and we will go to the xpFoam object. So click that, bring it into the scene. Now, the xpFoam object requires a new emitter to be able to make the new foam particles, and that's what this create button is for. So let's click that, and we get a new emitter. Let's just rename it, basic tab, call this emitter foam. And let's just play it on default and see what we get. I'll make the water body invisible. So now we should only be watching the foam particles, and we're not getting anything at all. And it's obviously not working. So what has gone wrong? Well, there's a couple of things. Let's go to our foam settings. First of all, it's set to only start making foam after 60 seconds of scene time has gone. So let's just put that back down to 0. And what I'd like to do with foam is there are two different types of foam particle that are born with this object. There are the Crest particles and aerate particles. And the Crest particles are based on the curviness of the crests of waves within a simulation. And the aerate is based on the particles the water particles bashing into each other and trapping air into each other, thus creating more foam particles. So what I like to do is to set these both up individually to get a really good handle on exactly what they're doing. So let's start with air rate. So I'll just switch off the crest rate, which means there will never be any crest particles. We're just dealing with air rate particles. And I'm going to put our air rate up to, say, 100. And let's see on the default settings whether we're going to get any air rate based particles. And we haven't got any yet, so something isn't quite working for us. So let's have a look at these air rate settings. So the air rate are concerned with the minimum and maximum speed, so it will not produce air rate particles if they are moving under this speed, and they will not produce them if they're moving over the max speed. And then the second thing it looks at is the minimum and maximum impact. So let's just reduce this minimum impact down to 0. And then we'll hit play and see if we get any air rate particles. And then we're still not getting any. So let's move the max down a bit. We'll keep moving it down. Keep moving it down. Keep moving it down. Now we're starting to get a couple of particles. So now we're almost at the bottom here. Look, let me put this on 1, say 0 to 1. Now we're starting to get some particles happening in there. So perhaps our minimum speed is restricting the development of these particles. Let's reduce this down a bit. Look, now we're getting loads more particles. So the speed was having an impact. Now I've restarted and played again, and now you can see, can you see that we have foam particles on the bottom and the edges of our cube, which is not really what we want. And the reason that's happening is, if I make our water particles visible again, the foam doesn't care which way is up. It just works out what is the surface of the water by the way in which the particles are in relation to each other. And as far as the foam is concerned, this side is the surface of the water as well, as is this side, as is the underneath. So the best way and the most efficient way to get this right is to set up a kill object, which will just kill any foam particles on those outside kind of peripheral parts. So let's do that now. Let's go to press F5 and we'll use this side on view. All right. So now we'll set up a kill object. Let's go to modifiers, control modifiers, and an XP kill. There it is. And look, we get this bounding box. So let's sort that out. We want it to be just inside there, which will get rid of any surface particles on this side. And then let's bring the height way down. So it'll get rid of the ones along the bottom. Like that. And let's come out of that view. And then we need to just go into this alternate side view and bring this kill object in. There we go. So now that's in, but this kill object is, look, it's set to outside bound, so it'll kill anything outside of this green square, but it's going to kill our water body particles as well as the foam ones. We don't want that. So we need to exclude it from the water body. So let's go into the emitter water body. Let's go to the modifiers tab and let's drag in the kill. And now this minus means that it's excluded. It's not going to count that. If it was on that ticked, it would mean it would work. Minus means it's not going to do anything. So let's hit play. Yep, so we've still got our water body particles. But if we go back to our F1 perspective view, the foam particles will no longer be being, well, they'll be generated, but they're killed immediately. All right. So we're starting to get something. It's not quite right yet. So let's go back to our foam settings. Let's go to our air rate and put this up. Now we've started to create some particles as they're being pushed around, which looks quite nice, but we just don't have enough. So let's put this rate up by a magnitude of 10. So now we'll set that to 1,000 air rate. And let's start it. We should be getting more particles. So, yep, so as it's pushing them around, we're getting loads more air rate particles now. So that's working really well, actually. Pleased with that. So let's just keep those settings as they are. We'll remember our air rate's going to be 1,000. Let's put it on 0 for now. So now we'll move on to our crest rate particles. So now if we hit play, we're not going to get any foam because we've got both rates set to 0. So let's move on to crest rate. Put this on, say, 100. So we're on default crest rate settings of 30% to 50%. And we're getting a little, but not much. So let's reduce the min crest down so the angle doesn't need to be as great on that crest. And then reduce our max crest down, which is going to give us more foam. Okay, back to the beginning. Let's reduce that max crest down even further. So we're going to get lots of crest particles where we don't have a huge curved crest. And that's because we've reduced this max crest way down. So let's put that back up because we want particles on the bits that are curling right over. But let's just ramp up our crest rate. So put it on 500. And let's see what we get. So yeah, every time we get big kind of splashy waves, we're starting to get these nice crest particles. That's looking good. Excellent. So let's mix that with our air rate particles. Put that back to 1,000. And now we have a mixture of the two. And that's looking really nice. We're getting this nice swirling effect as they kind of dissipate. Very nice indeed. And it's amazing how much detail the foam brings to the simulation. That's a really nice aggressive bit. So that's looking lovely. Now, these, at the moment, we've got the life of these foam particles set to 150 frames with a bit of variation. So let's just increase that variation a little bit so they will die off. Arguably, we could maybe reduce it a little as well. Let's maybe put it down to 120 frames so they don't last quite as long. And this is looking very good. I don't know if you can notice right at the beginning, we're getting a little bit of foam created. And the reason that's happening is because as soon as we hit play, the gravity has an effect on our particles and they drop slightly and it's creating this foam. So just to avoid that, let's not animate our platonic until the water is settled, and also let's not activate our foam until the water is settled as well. So let's just switch off the foam and let's just get an idea of when that water settles. So there's the drop and it's kind of settled there. So 20, let's just say 20 frames. So in the foam, let's activate it again. After age, 20 frames. Excellent. And then in our vibrate tag, let's do the same. So let's go to the basic and we can put a keyframe on the enabled on frame. What are we on? 22. Let's go back one frame, disable it. We've got the water settling, and as it starts to move, we then get our foam creation. And it's looking really nice, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing how much detail that foam brings to these sims. It's looking fantastic, swirling around the place, and that's looking great. Okay, so the one problem that we have here, we have to remember that our technique here is to create a small dynamic area of water where our object can interact, and then we are going to comp that into a much larger non-dynamic body of water, which will be much quicker to simulate and to render. If we were to create an almost limitless ocean in a dynamic way, it would just take about we couldn't simulate it. So we do this in a small dynamic container, and then we need to be able to match this exactly and comp it into a much larger sea. And one thing we have to make sure is that the foam never pushes back and bounces back off of these walls. Now, it's not bouncing back off the collider because we're actually killing the foam before it gets to the end. But because of that, we're getting this very straight killed foam line, which if we comp this onto another ocean, you're just going to see that line. It's going to break the illusion. So what we need to do is make this box bigger so it can contain the entire foam animation. We want it to be as small as possible, but be able to contain the entire foam animation so we're not losing these straight edges. So now that we have got that working as we like it and it's looking good, what we could do is just increase the size of both our collider box and the emitter. So let's do that. Let's get our cube, and at the moment we set it in the X and Z to 200. So let's maybe put 350 by 350. So that's a lot bigger. Maybe slightly more. Let's just try it. Let's be safe. Let's try 400. Now remember, the more you do this, the more you're going to up your caching time, because we're going to be using loads more dynamic particles. So FluidFX is having to work a lot more. But by having a big one, we're more likely to have a perfect foam animation contained within this without reaching the edges. So we need to do the same with the emitter. So let's go to our emitter water body object, and let's put the X to 400 and the Z to 400. And then we need to readjust our kill object, because that needs to come virtually to the edge of the bounds. There we go. And let's do the same with the other side of the kill object. Where's my handle? There it is. There we go. So this is going to work similarly. The particle animation will be similar because we haven't changed the particle size, so the fluid kind of resolution is the same. It's just a much bigger body of water, which means it will take longer to simulate. There's nothing we can do about that, but it should mean that we are able to contain the foam within it. So instead of playing this through, you can see that we've still got playback and we can see it animating, but it's much slower. So let's set up a cache system so we can actually cache this out and have a look at the result. So we'll do that by going to the utilities. Let's bring in a cache object. We're going to save to external files, and we need a path where we're going to save those cache files. So let's hit the browser button. I've set up a library here, DynamicOcean. And let's go to DynamicOcean. I'm going to make another new folder actually and call this one cache. And let's hit OK. And that's it. So we're going to cache the water body and the foam. Excellent, that's all ready. So we're going to hit build cache. So I will leave this running, come back to you when it's finished, tell you how long it took. We can have a look at the animation and then move on to the next stage. Okay, so that cache took 4 minutes and 20 seconds to complete. Let's have a play through. We'll get near to real-time playback on this. So that's looking really nice, isn't it? Very fluid. If anything, we can perhaps have a little bit more kind of dynamism in the fluid motion here. And a couple of ways that we could achieve that. Let's go to our water body emitter. We'll go to the extended data. Here we are in the fluid data tab. Let's just reduce some of that viscosity down to say 15. Let's also reduce the surface tension by 1. And in our vibrate tag, let's just increase that frequency up to get a bit more dynamic movement, up to say 1.4. Okay, so let's go back to our cache and we'll build cache, overwrite. We'll give that another run through and we'll review those changes. Should be about 4 or 5 minutes. So we'll come back when it's done. Okay, and that cache took 5 minutes and 11 seconds. Let's have a look at those changes. There we go. And that's looking nicer to my eye. Some nice splashing, but our foam is never reaching the very extremities, because remember, that wouldn't be good for when we get to the comp stage. But we're able to work with this. This is going to work well. So arguably, you could maybe get the foam particles to fade a little bit more quickly. But, I mean, to be honest with you, this is looking pretty nice. I'm happy with this. So then, that's looking really good. So now we need to move on to the stage where we can change this from what is a very nice looking dynamic water body to one which looks like it's part of a huge ocean, because at the moment it just is what it is, and it's kind of reflecting off the walls of this domain. So we're going to work on that in the next stage. So let's just get this system, and let's just hold Control-Alt and deactivate the whole lot for now, so we no longer have that system up and running. And let's go to our xParticles menu, and we'll go to our generators, and we want to generate an xpOcean. So if we bring it in its default form, we have this, what looks like a plane, and it's kind of got this animated wave pattern. So let's have a look at those settings. So in default, it's set to primitive, which brings in its own geometry, and it is this wave. And we've got various different settings. The width and the height are obviously the size of that primitive. And then the segments, if we hit ND, the segments just give it more segments, which means like any deformed object, the more segments you have, the more polygons, the more detailed that deformation. Let's hit NA just to get rid of that. And then we've got various different settings to alter the way in which these waves work. First of all, we've got wave height. So we've got the waves going smaller and bigger. We have a time scale, which is kind of like almost an animation speed. You can think of the time scale. The noise type is set by default to Tessendorf, which is this type of wave simulating noise. The resolution is the resolution of the map that is driving this deformation. So the higher up you go in the resolution, the more kind of detailed deformation you get, but you will experience significant viewport slowdown because it's having to process much higher resolution maps to make this distort. So we can just leave that on default for now. And then we've got various other different sliders. We have an ocean size. So bring it up, it makes a much bigger scale ocean. Bring it down, it makes it much smaller. So we have an ocean size setting. We have a smallest wave setting, which is a bit like a detail setting, really. If we put this up, it'll smoothen it right out. Bring it down, and it adds more detail. Then the choppiness slide is an interesting one. It kind of pinches in on the X and Z, the deformation, and it kind of creates these pinches on the waves, which it's kind of like distorting and stretching it, really, and it gives you this bit of detail. The problem is if you go too far on choppiness, it overlaps itself and it breaks that deformation. So you need to be kind of less is more on the choppiness, really. Then we have an ocean depth, which will slightly change the way in which those waves are moving. Now we have a wind speed, which is a really important slider. The wind speed, if you increase this, it kind of makes a bigger swell. If you imagine the bigger the gale, you're going to be moving much larger volumes of water. So more wind speed equals a much bigger swell. Once you've got a bigger swell, you can risk a little bit more choppiness to get more detail. You can even increase that wave height. If you do, you'll have to reduce your choppiness. So as you can see, these sliders all kind of play off each other. Nothing really works in isolation. But very quickly, you can mess around and get some fantastic looking oceans with this. So what we want for ours is we're not going to go for a huge ocean, actually. We're going to go for a relatively tame, just kind of bobbing along ocean. Let's increase that time scale a bit. Something like that. Maybe a slightly more choppiness. All right, we can. The damping is an interesting one. If you have the dampening on 0, the ocean is just reflecting back and forth, and there's no kind of continuous looking movement. And the more damping you introduce, the more wind direction movement you get, until if you put it onto full, you can see, look, we've just got a perfectly moving swell, which is following the wind direction. If we change the wind direction, that movement changes. If we, but for realism, you do want a little bit of reflections in that. So if you have it, I mean, 0.9, to be honest, is a good number, and you get a little bit of reflection. It just makes it feel that little bit more realistic. So that's going to be our basic ocean shape and animation. So how do we use this to make our interactive dynamic water system look like it's part of this big ocean? Well, this is the real power of xpOcean, is that we can use it in primitive mode, but we can also use it in Deformer mode. So let's put it into Deformer mode. And now it's disappeared because it's acting as a deformer. It's just like any of the other Cinema 4D deformers now, and it needs to be a sibling or a child of the thing that you want to deform. Now, this is the amazing trick. Let's just reopen our xParticle system and reactivate it by holding Control and Alt. And let's just move forward. So we have this sim, which is a flat water body, but it's just interacting with our collider object. Look what happens. For now, I'm just going to switch off our foam. Let's just switch off the foam. So we have this dynamic water body. But look, let's go to generators. Let's choose a generator, and we'll pick an OpenVDB mesher. And there it is. And this mesher, we're going to mesh the water body particles. So let's drag the water body particles into the sources window. And now it's meshed it. Let's make the water body particles invisible. So this is too blobby at the moment. So let's go to our point radius and put it down to, say, 2. So now we have an OpenVDB mesh which is animating with the movement of our dynamic water body FluidFX particles. Let's have a look. There we go, look, and we're getting that animation. Now, I haven't put any smoothing filters on or anything yet, but look, we can see now that we have a mesh that is animating with all that nice fluid motion. Fantastic. But here is the cool thing. Because the OpenVDB mesher is creating these polygons, it can be deformed by any Cinema 4D deformer. So if we put our xpOcean as a child of the OpenVDB mesher, it becomes deformed by those waves. But it's still going to respect that animation from its source, which is our dynamic water body particles. So if we hit play now, we're getting this wave animation. Playback isn't amazing at this point because obviously it's creating all these polygons live. But look, so we have our water surface, but we've also got that wave deformed water surface with our interaction of our live kind of dynamic sim. So we've got the best of both worlds, which is really cool. So how can we make this better? Because if we get our foam particles, these foam particles aren't being deformed by the xpOcean like the OpenVDB mesher is. So they're going to look like they're going to be sinking underneath of these waves now. So that's not working. But don't forget, and a lot of people do, that X particles can also be deformed by any Cinema 4D deformer, including xpOcean. So what we are going to do is we are going to recache these two particles, but we are going to set the foam particles to be deformed by our xpOcean. So let's get that set up. Before we do, I just think our wave's a little bit too strenuous for this look. So let's go to our xpOcean. We'll set the displacement space from local to world. This is in the xpOcean Deformer. Now, this is a very important step, because what this is going to do is it means that any other object that is being deformed by this will be deformed by the same noise. It'll be a kind of a continuous noise across the entire scene. And it's a really important step. We'll demonstrate that a little bit later. But we want this to be in world mode. And let's just take let's have a look. We want the wave height to be a bit smaller. Yeah, that's looking better. Maybe fraction more choppiness. There we go. That's looking more like it, I think. Very nice. All right, so what do we need to do? So we want to recache, and at this stage, I'm not going to cache the OpenVDB mesher, so let's just switch that off. We're going to recache these. But the foam particles, we want them to be distorted by this xpOcean. So let's go to the Emitter foam. We're going to go to the Modifiers tab, drag in the ocean, and make sure it's on tick, yes, affect those foam particles. Excellent. So now we will go to the cache object, and we want to recache this. So let's hit build cache, overwrite, and we need to let this run through again. So it's going to be another 5 minutes or so. So we'll do that. We'll let it run through, and I'll come back to you when it's finished. Okay, so again, that was about 5.5 minutes, that cache, 5 minutes 31. Let's just make our emitter water body particles invisible. And so now you can see we've got what seems like a very similar simulation, but look, our foam particles are now animating in exactly the same way as our xpOcean waves because they are being deformed by them, which is amazing. It's such a neat trick. So that is working really well. Let's just make our OpenVDB mesher visible again, and you can see the trick that we are going for. So we get our animating waves, and our foam particles are now going to feel like they are in this same sim. So yeah, look, as it moves away and displaces the water, and we get our foam particles moving in the same way, but they're still respecting and following the kind of underlying wave surface. And this is looking really, really nice. Excellent. So what we could do with now is getting this cached out. Let's just hit ND to have a look at our OpenVDB line. So arguably, we could have this mesh slightly higher resolution. Remember, with our xpOcean object, the more resolution in your mesh, the more kind of detail is going to come through in those waves. So let's go to our OpenVDB mesher, and let's go to our voxel size and put it down to, say, 3. Which is more. Let's go down to, say, 2. So obviously this will take longer to calculate, but look, you can see more detail coming through that mesh now. And we can just perhaps smoothen out a little bit of these creases. There's again, a couple of different ways we can smoothen out. We can go to the filters within the mesh and add a filter. So just the default median, if I take that off, it's just smoothed out some of those bumps. Another one that's good for fluids, if we just deselect the medium, if we bring in a curvature, it kind of smoothens out bumps, but doesn't offer too aggressive a smoothing on other parts, which is quite nice for fluid, because you want some of this kind of spikiness and kind of unevenness in the fluid surface. So that's looking pretty nice, just like that, I would say. So let's just move forward a few frames. Let's go forward to frame 170. Very nice. That's looking excellent. All right, so let's get this properly cached up now then, because we want to cache the OpenVDB mesher as well. So to do that, all we need to do is have it active. Let's go back to our cache object, and we're going to go to build cache, but this time, instead of overwriting, which would overwrite both the foam and the water body, we can just hit continue. And what that'll do is it won't bother trying to recache what's already cached here, the foam and the water body. It'll just cache the OpenVDB mesher. So let's hit continue. It'll run through that. Once that's finished, I'll come back to tell you how long it took, and we'll have a look at that final animation. All right, and that was a faster cache because it wasn't having to do the fluids this time, just the mesh. That's 3 minutes, 15 seconds. And it looks quite right, actually, but there's something a little bit off, isn't there? Now, the problem here is that we cached the OpenVDB mesher with the xpOcean deforming it, and it's cached that. But the xpOcean is still active, and it's trying to, well, it is deforming it again. So we've got kind of a double strength xpOcean here. So now we've cached, let's just deactivate the xpOcean, and there we go. This is all in cache now, and that's kind of working nicely. So let's just play this through. And there we've got that splash working really nicely, foam working well. And it's all kind of coherently moving as it should, but it's being deformed by those waves where necessary. So, very nice technique, and it's working really nicely for us. Okay, so another thing we're able to do after the event, you can see right near the beginning of our scene, before our particles settle, you can see a little bit of particle separation as our mesh, as they kind of settle onto the floor. And we can get around that. Another really nice thing you can do with the OpenVDB mesh, and you saw with the xpOcean, is that even when it's cached, it can still be deformed. So let's go to the Cinema 4D deformers and bring out a smoothing deformer. We'll make that a child of the OpenVDB mesher. And look, we get the stiffness by default is 30%. We probably don't need that. We don't need it to be that smooth. Let's increase the stiffness, which brings you closer to its original state. And then look, that's just enough to smoothen out. Oh, we've got a little bit at the beginning. We're not going to be rendering at this stage anyway, actually, but we can just increase that smoothness just to get rid of those. And if we wanted this beginning bit, I guess we could animate this stiffness. So there's very little stiffness at the beginning. And then once that's settled, we could bring it back just to bring back, because you want the detail really. But there we go. So we've got this nice water body and that's looking fantastic. Excellent. So let's just have a look at doing a really quick kind of hardware render here, and then we'll look at ways of how we can comp this quite small dynamic fluid body in with a much larger ocean to make it feel like it's a proper ocean that is dynamic, even though only this very small little bit in reality was dynamic. So we'll sort that out now. So let's get a material sorted out, first of all, for our mesher. We will, we're just going to do a viewport render here, a hardware render, but we can still make this look a bit nicer. So let's just double click in our window here, make a new Cinema 4D material, and we'll just drag that onto the mesher. Let's double click to get our material settings. Right, so we could kind of do reflectance and bring in an HDRI as a sky object and all that, but actually we just want this to render quickly. We don't necessarily want it to be physically accurate, so we can just fake the look of this by actually using a nice little shader in the color channel. So we'll just go to texture and we'll bring in a Fresnel. So what a Fresnel does is it kind of applies this black to white gradient to, it's dependent on the camera position angle to the object. So the parts of the object directly facing the camera will be black, and as they are facing away from the camera, they're mapped to white. And so you can see, look, that we get this kind of changing gradient over our object, which actually looks pretty decent for a reflective surface. And obviously it's really quick to render. So let's just change the color of that. We'll just do all of the colors. Instead of having a sky with reflections, we'll just color this gradient. So let's go to, we can bring in a preset, and there will be a sky preset in here. There's a couple. Yeah, look, sky 1, 2, and 3. Let's choose sky, let's choose sky 2. So there you can kind of see that you've got a very basic water going on. So let's just have a look. We are going to, let's pick the angle. We're going to view this from, I don't know, something like this. And what we'll do is we'll extend our ocean out in this area. So something like that. So then let's just make adjustments to this to make that look a bit more pleasing. So we can take out some of these knots. There we go. Let's bring this up. There we are. And take out that knot. A bit more white in there. And obviously you pay much more attention to this than what I'm doing. Maybe something a bit like that. Okay. And even with a really quick kind of cheaty texture on there, you can see that with our foam particles, it's looking pretty decent. I mean, this is obviously just viewport preview, but that foam really brings out the detail of that water sim. That looks really cool. I think what we could perhaps do, look, let's move these knots up a bit. Yeah, that's looking better. And this one, we'll just make it a bit lighter. That's it. So the saturation coming out makes it feel a bit better. All right. And this one, again, let's take out a bit of the saturation. Darken it maybe. Okay. There we go. Now that's looking quite nice and foreboding. We might need to make a change to that when we create the rest of the ocean, but for now that's going to work fine for us. Excellent. So let's close down that material. So what we want to do, let's just put a camera in there. There we go. And I want a protection tag. Let's just hit Shift-C to bring up the commander. And I'm going to type in protection. There's protection tags in the rigging tags. So now I can't move the camera. Right, so now what we want to do is we want to create the rest of this water body. So this is the fantastic thing, well, one of the many fantastic things of xpOcean. Let's just bring it out of this hierarchy because we've cached it into the OpenVDB mesher, so it no longer needs it. Let's bring in a plane object. And this plane object, we're going to move down to approximately the same level as the mesher. And then let's increase its width. Let's move it back. We're basically wanting to fill out the scene here. So there we go. And then let's increase the height, which is that way on the Z. So if we hit ND, we want to match the density of polygons in the OpenVDB mesh, and we need to make the plane the same. So let's go to the plane and let's add, say, we're going to want maybe 300 by 300, even more than that. We could go 500 by 500, and let's just come out of that camera. See, even that's not enough. Let's go 800 by 800. Oops, 800. So that's looking pretty similar now, isn't it? Okay, let's go back in and hit NA to get rid of those. So let's put our material on the plane. And now if we make our, let's bring the plane into our utilities folder. And if we make the ocean a child of the plane and activate it, you will see that because we have our xpOcean, remember we put it in world displacement mode, that means that the deformation is fixed in world space. So we can move our plane anywhere around and it's still going to be in the same displacement space as it is on our mesher, which means that apart from these edges, we have really nicely coherent, cohesive deformation. Can you see, look, these waves are moving in exactly the same way. Now, the problem we have with the join is we have a bit of a bump here. And the reason that is that the plane is perfectly flat and our OpenVDB mesher is actually, it's meshing particles which aren't a perfectly flat surface. And so we have a little bit, there's a bit of a disparity between the two. What we could do, though, is we could, for a start, move the plane up ever so slightly. Let's deform it again. So that has reduced that bump. But here's what we're going to do. We are going to render out just our dynamic ocean like this. Okay. And then once that's finished, we are going to get that off and we are going to render out just the plane, this one. And then in comp, all we need to do is mask out anywhere these lines here. And this is why we didn't want the foam to come right to the edge of our domain, because we'll just mask them out, layer them up, and it'll look infinite. So let's get this set up then. So first of all, we'll do our hardware render of our mesher. So let's make that inactive, make the ocean inactive. We don't need to have the water body particles active because the mesher is cached. So here we go, looking good. All right, that's nice. So at the beginning of the simulation, we've got, as the particles are settling, we've got a little bit of bumpy separation here where it would have been nice to have started our animation of our platonic once this had properly settled, and that you see, look, we've got a perfectly smooth mesh. Just the first few frames of that animation, we've got a little bit of a bumpy mesh, which is not the end of the world, but obviously if you were doing it for real, you'd smooth that out. What we can do is let's get our smoothing deformer, and once it's smoothed, okay, so we've got to a frame where everything's nice and smooth. Let's just maybe reduce it slightly more, that stiffness. Let's hit a keyframe, and then let's go back a bit. And yeah, so we want much more smoothing. Hit a keyframe. So now it should kind of maybe ease in a little bit more, and it's not going to be quite as prominent. There you go. So that's cleaned that up. But obviously, if you're doing it for real, you would resim it until you had a perfectly smooth mesh all the way through from the point at which you want to render. Right, so we want to get rendering and we're going to do a hardware render. So what are we going to do? We want to get rid of all of this viewport furniture. So the quickest way to do that, let's just go to the filter option and put no filters. Then go to filter and just hit, well, we want generators. And then we're going to see, let's have a look, all of the stuff that we want. We don't want to see this box, so let's just deactivate the cube. Let's go to our foam emitter, which is what this red square is showing. Let's go to display and uncheck draw emitter. So there we go. That's it. Very nice. Very cool. That's looking excellent. Love it. All right, so let's go to our render settings and we'll go to output. We want to save all frames. We'll just do it at 720p. Let's go to our save and we'll save it as an EXR and we'll do a 16-bit. And let's choose a file path. And I have my dynamic ocean. Look, I have an empty render folder here. So we'll save it in there. And then we need a file name. Let's put dynamic ocean hero. Hit save. Great, that's all good. So we need to change our renderer to the hardware OpenGL renderer. We want to activate this, reflections, and that'll look okay. Let's just put some anti-aliasing on there for look. Right, okay, so that's that. Excellent. So let's hit render to picture viewer. So this should chug through this really quickly because it is, obviously it's hardware render, so not a huge amount going on. So I'll let this render. Once it's finished, I'll come back to you, tell you how long it took, and then we'll get on with rendering the background element, which is going to be our big, large ocean. Okay, so that render has finished and it was a pretty quick one. Let's just have a look. It was 2 minutes and 46 seconds. And so here we have our hero water. And this is not quite real time. This is just loading it in, so it's a bit quick. Here we go. Here's the proper speed. And we've got this nice thrashing platonic moving around in our ocean with some really nice foam, some water deformation. And that's looking really nice. All right, so that's that one. Let's just come out of the picture viewer. So now what we want to do is our second render. So what do we need to do? Switch off our foam, switch off our OpenVDB mesher. We don't need any of that. Let's activate our plane and our ocean object. We'll get rid of our platonic. And now we just need to render this out as well. So let's go to our render settings. We'll save. And this one, we'll save this as dynamic ocean. This one's going to be BG, background. Save, and that looks good. So let's hit render. So this will chug through. Again, it'll be 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will come back, have a look, and we'll get them comped together. So here we are in After Effects, and we have our two rendered scenes here. We have our background and our hero. So let's just bring in our background first. So there we have our background animating away nicely. That's our big ocean. So now obviously we want to see our hero. So let's get our hero pass. Let's put this on the top. Now obviously we didn't render an alpha with this because all we're going to do is we're going to mask out the sides of this ocean. And we want it to start kind of when it settles down. So we were going to start about there, weren't we? So let's just trim our work area to there. Okay. So very simply, let's just go to our mask tool and we're just going to draw a bog standard mask. There we go. Let's hit MM and let's put a bit of feathering on the mask. So if I just make the other ocean visible, let's hide that mask line. So that's basically it. That is our mask. Now this is the reason why it's so important to make sure that your foam doesn't go too close to the edge of your domain, because we need to be able to mask out this to feather it over the top of our other ocean. So here you can see, look, it's slightly coming out. So let's have a look at our mask path. We could do a bit more of an intricate mask here. and just bring it out slightly so we don't lose that detail. There we go. So realistically, if we were doing this for production, it would be nice to have a slightly even bigger domain that we simulated, so we weren't running into these problems and having to kind of animate masks when it comes to output. But for our intents and purposes, this is looking really good. Very nice. So then when we reintroduce the C, we have an indistinguishable join, and that's because both scenes are being displaced by the same xpOcean. And there you go. If we play that through, there we have what looks like an ocean that could be dynamic the whole surface over, but in reality, it's only our small section. But then we've easily been able to comp that, and it's looking really nice. So that is how we can set up using xpOcean to get the general ocean wave motion, but then use xpFluidFX and xpFoam to create this really nice dynamic detail of our moving object interacting with that water surface.